In August 1939, as Europe slid towards another world war, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression treaty. The Nazi-Soviet pact came as a complete surprise to other nations, given the ideological differences between the two countries. It ushered in a period of military cooperation which allowed Hitler to ignore Western diplomatic moves and invade Poland. Stalin's forces then attacked from the west and completed the subjugation and partition of the Polish state. For the next year and a half, Germany also benefited economically from the arrangement, with Russia exporting grain and oil in return for manufactured goods. Soviet cooperation allowed Hitler to expand his plans for European domination. In May 1940, the Blitzkrieg rolled westwards and France was conquered in 6 weeks. But peace with Russia would not last. Hitler had always wanted to see Germany expand eastwards to gain Lebensraum, or living space, for its people. After the fall of France, Hitler ordered plans to be drawn up for an invasion of the Soviet Union. He intended to destroy what he saw as Stalin's Jewish Bolshevist regime and establish Nazi hegemony. The conquest and enslavement of the Soviet Union's racially inferior Slavic populations would be part of a grand plan of Germanization and economic exploitation, lasting well beyond the expected military victory. Regardless of recent economic and political cooperation, the Soviet Union was regarded as the natural enemy of Nazi Germany and a key strategic objective. After a 5-week delay, while operations in Greece and Yugoslavia were completed, Operation Barbarossa, named after the all-conquering medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I, was launched on 22 June 1941. Over 3.5 million German and other Axis troops attacked along a 1,800-mile front. A total of 148 divisions, 80% of the German army, were committed to the enterprise. 17 panzer divisions, formed into 4 panzer groups, formed the vanguard with 3,400 tanks. They were supported by 2,700 aircraft of the Luftwaffe. It was the largest invasion force to date. The Soviets had massed large forces on their western frontier, but they were under orders not to provoke the Germans. Although mistrustful of Hitler, Stalin did not believe that he would attack so soon, despite the ominous German build-up and a stream of intelligence warnings. He had some 5 million men available immediately and a total of 23,000 tanks, but the Red Army was still unprepared when the Germans struck. The Germans got off to a good start, with the panzer groups quickly pushing towards their objectives and Russian forces falling apart in confusion. They were greatly helped by the Luftwaffe's bombing of Soviet airfields, artillery positions and troop concentrations. The Germans quickly established air superiority. On the first day, alone 1,800 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, plunged towards Leningrad with General Erich Hauptner's Panzer Group 4 in the lead. Russian forces in this sector were thinly spread, and the panzers covered 500 miles, even 4 km, in 3 weeks. By mid-July, they were only 60 miles, 96 km, from their objective. Army Group Centre, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, also made rapid progress. By 28 June, Panzer Group 2, led by General Heinz Guderian, and General Hermann Hoth's Panzer Group 3 had encircled 3 Russian armies and captured over 320,000 men in the Bialystok-Minsk pockets. The 2 panzer groups then pressed ahead, linking up on the far side of Smolensk on 27 July in another double envelopment. 2 more Russian armies were trapped and destroyed, and another 300,000 troops taken prisoner. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had the furthest to go, and his attack also faced the stiffest Soviet resistance. Most of the Russian armour was on this front, but by early July von Rundstedt had pushed out beyond the pre-1939 Polish frontier. General Ewald von Kleist's Panzer Group 1 was slowed by Soviet flanking attacks as it headed for Kiev, the capital of Ukraine and key to the coal-rich Donetsk basin. On 8 August, the Germans surrounded 2 Soviet armies, capturing 100,000 men in the Uman pocket, and reached the Dnieper. The naval port of Odessa on the Black Sea was also besieged. Up to this point, all seemed to be going well, the only major problem being the time needed for the infantry to catch up with the panzers and mop up pockets of Russian defense. But Soviet resistance was now stiffening, despite catastrophic losses. A German salient around Yelnya, southeast of Smolensk, was recaptured in a costly but successful counterattack. Meanwhile, Army Group Centre's supply situation was becoming critical. Hitler decided to halt the advance on Moscow and reinforce army groups north and south. Panzer Group 3 was sent north to support the drive on Leningrad, while Guderian's tanks were dispatched to help Army Group South take Kiev. The German High Command protested vigorously. The panzers were only 220 miles from Moscow, but Hitler regarded the resource-rich Ukraine as more important. On 21 August, he ordered that the conquest of the Crimea and the Donetsk Basin be given priority. The Soviets were completely fooled by German moves. 5 Soviet armies were trapped in a vast salient around Kiev. As usual, Stalin refused to sanction a withdrawal before the pocket was sealed. By the end of September, Kiev had fallen and over 650,000 Russian troops killed or captured. The Germans pushed along the Black Sea coast and into the Crimea, laying siege to Sevastopol. In October, Kharkov fell, but by now the Germans were exhausted. The fighting had severely depleted their ranks and supply lines were stretched to the limit. For now, the southern front stayed where it was. In the north too, German forces had reached their limit. In September, with the aid of their Finnish allies, they cut Leningrad off from the rest of Russia, but lacked the strength to take the city. Instead, Hitler ordered that it be starved into submission. The epic siege would last 890 days. Hitler now decided to resume the battle for Moscow. On 2 October, he unleashed Operation Typhoon. He believed the Russians had been fatally weakened and lacked the strength to defend their capital. One more push would see it fall and victory would be his. But the Red Army had been reinforced. Almost 1 million Soviet troops were in place, although they had few tanks and aircraft left. A multi-layered ring of defences had been thrown around the capital, and its citizens had been mobilised. The German offensive was carried out by a reinforced army group centre, comprising 3 infantry armies and 3 panzer groups, 1 million men and 1,700 tanks. And the weather was beginning to turn. Once again, the initial assault was a success. The Panzer Division stormed ahead, and over 600,000 Russian soldiers were captured in 2 more huge encirclements near the cities of Bryansk and Vyazma. But as they reached the approaches to Moscow, the German formation slowed to a crawl. Autumn rains had turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. It was the Rasputitsa. The quagmire season, and wheeled and horse-drawn transport became hopelessly stuck. The Germans chose to temporarily halt operations. In mid-November, with the temperature dropping and the ground now frozen hard, the panzers attempted a final pincer attack around Moscow itself. The delay had given the Soviets time to bring in further reinforcements, including reservists and troops from Siberia and the eastern borders. The northern German pincer was the most successful and got within 12 miles of the city. On 2 December, a reconnaissance unit got within 5 miles of Moscow. Though tantalizingly close, this was the limit of the entire advance. The depleted German units were exhausted and frozen into inactivity in the deep snow. On 5 December, the Soviets launched a surprise counteroffensive. The Germans were forced into a retreat, despite Hitler's call to defend every foot of ground. Guderian and several other senior generals who advised withdrawal was the Russians succeeded in crushing various German formations in encirclements of their own. Luftwaffe struggled to operate, but performed vital work, ferrying supplies to cut-off units and harrying the Russian advance. Army Group Centre was pushed back up to 150 miles from Moscow. A furious Hitler dismissed the commander-in-chief of the German army, Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, and appointed himself in his place. But why did Operation Barbarossa fail? Operation Barbarossa had clearly failed. Despite the serious losses inflicted on the Red Army and extensive territorial gains, the mission to completely destroy Soviet fighting power and force a capitulation was not achieved. One of the most important reasons for this was poor strategic planning. The Germans had no satisfactory long-term plan for the invasion. They mistakenly assumed that the campaign would be a short one and that the Soviets would give in after suffering the shock of massive initial defeats. Hitler had assured the High Command that we have only to kick in the front door and the whole rotten edifice will come tumbling down. But Russia was not France. The shock value of the initial Blitzkrieg was dissipated by the vast distances, logistical difficulties and Soviet troop numbers, all of which caused attritional losses of German forces which could not be sustained. Perhaps the most important reason of all for the defeat of Operation Barbarossa was the tenacious resistance of the defenders. The Germans completely underestimated the Soviet will to fight. Hitler's announcement that the war in the East was one of annihilation, and Stalin's astute call to defend Mother Russia rather than his own regime gave the ordinary Russian soldier, no matter how coerced or badly led, every reason to battle to the death. Hitler's infamous Commissar Orders, which sanctioned the execution of all captured political officers, also stiffened Russian resolve. The Russian soldier was found to be a hardy and implacable foe and quickly gained the respect of the majority of German frontline troops. No Western enemy would come close to the Soviets in sheer staying power. Despite the failure and huge losses of our Barbarossa, Hitler launched another major strategic offensive in June 1942, this time towards the Caucasus Mountains and the oil fields of Baku beyond. Morale was still generally high and German forces maintained the capacity to inflict further massive losses on badly handled Soviet formations. As the German columns advanced across the seemingly infinite spaces of the steppe towards their distant objectives, including a city named Stalingrad, the victory in the EST that had once seemed so certain receded even further from sight. Logistics was another hugely important factor in the German defeat. No matter how fast or far the fighting formations advanced, they were dependent on timely supplies of fuel and ammunition. This became an ever greater problem as the army progressed deeper into Soviet territory and further away from its own railheads. Not only were the distances much greater than they had been during the French campaign, but the Soviet transport infrastructure was much poorer. German engineers struggled to convert the Russian railway gauge to one which their own locomotives and rolling stock could use. Meanwhile, the multitude of lorries and horse-drawn wagons in which the supplies were transported were forced to negotiate Russian dirt roads, which became virtually impassable after prolonged rain. The debilitating effects of the weather and terrain were not properly taken into account when planning the campaign. The numerous forests, marshes and rivers slowed the advance during the summer. The autumn Rasputitsa and the onset of the brutal Russian winter brought it to a halt during Operation Typhoon. Tank and vehicle lubricants froze as temperatures plunged to record lows. Winter clothing supplies were held up in Poland as fuel and ammunition took priority. If anything symbolizes the failure of Barbarossa, it is the image of inadequately equipped German troops shivering in the snows before Moscow. Hitler's input has been heavily criticized, not least by his generals at the time. Moscow was always a more important objective to the German High Command than it was to Hitler, who was more concerned with destroying Soviet field armies and capturing vital industrial resources. His switching of the main thrust from the Central Front to Leningrad in the north and Ukraine in the south was to an extent militarily sensible given the weakness of Army Group Center after the Smolensk battles and the threats to its flanks. Indeed, the diversion actually worked in the Germans' favor, since it surprised the Soviets and resulted in the destruction of huge Soviet forces around Kiev. But it also threw away Germany's only real chance of outright victory. Thank you for watching. Your time and attention are greatly appreciated. If you have any more questions or need assistance, feel free to ask. Please subscribe.